Right then guys, here I am for my 10th all seasons of career mode video. I've made one of these on every Codemasters F1 game since F1 2010. Apart from F1 2013 and 2014, because there'd be no point doing so for those games given the lack of performance tiers or any form of car upgrade system. And F1 2015 because that game didn't even have a career mode. Nevertheless, here's how 10 seasons and 220 Grand Prix played out on F1 22. I started my Team career with the newcomer option and I left all of the career settings, including the team and driver acclaim earning rates, on default. In the first season I've got Oscar Piastri as my teammate and Ferrari as my engine supplier. Mid-season driver transfers, as rare as they are in real life, are far more common an occurrence in F1 22. There were 4 changes in the first season, namely Lance Stroll left his dad's team for the junior Red Bull team of AlphaTauri. Alex Albon took Stroll's place at Aston Martin, leaving Kevin Magnussen to jump ship from Haas to Williams. Finally, Dan Ticktum broke into F1 with Haas, and all of that means Yuki Tsunoda, despite being higher rated than Ticktum and even some of the other drivers who start in F1, was dropped from the championship entirely a mere half a season into this career. Despite McLaren still only having the 5th fastest car at this point in the year, Lando Norris somehow won a simulated Japanese Grand Prix. Leclerc took second with Alonso in the 4th best car on the grid on the bottom step of the podium, beating both Verstappen and Hamilton, who were fighting for the driver's title 2021 style. A DNF for Hamilton in the very next round, the American Grand Prix, effectively killed his title hopes, and in Brazil, with a round to spare, Max Verstappen won the Drivers' Championship, despite Hamilton winning the Brazilian Grand Prix and taking the fastest lap. In the end, 38 points separated the title rivals, with Leclerc the next nearest driver and the only one within 100 points of Hamilton and Verstappen. Sainz beat Perez and Russell, although it is worth noting that for some reason, and this particular season was recorded way back on version 1.04 of the game, Russell was stuck on 79 overall, which is 11 lower than what he should be and even 2 lower than what he was at the end of F1 2021. This does eventually fix itself, albeit not until halfway through the 4th season. And I hate that it ruins the realism, but that's the game's fault for being so glitchy at launch. Alonso and Norris were the best of the rest and the last to get into triple figures. Fortunately for Alpine though, despite the fact that Ocon only scored 32 points and finished 11th in the standings behind Gasly and more importantly Ricciardo, Alonso's 34 point gap in front of Norris meant Alpine beat McLaren in the Constructors' Championship. Speaking of which, it was tight at the top of that table as Red Bull, Ferrari and Mercedes all crested the 600 point mark. Red Bull won and Ferrari overtook Mercedes in the final round of the season to just about claim the runner-up spot. Lower down it gets a bit messier given the mid-season driver transfers, but AlphaTauri took 6th thanks in huge part to Gasly, and Alfa Romeo 7th thanks entirely to Bottas. Joe was one of 6 drivers not to score any points, along with me and my teammate Piastri. Dan Ticktum didn't, but he only did the second half of the season, whereas Schumacher and Magnussen got their one solitary point within the first 2 rounds. There were 4 driver changes for the second season on top of the 4 we saw in the middle of last season. Well, actually there were 5 if you include me getting in Nico Hülkenberg to be my teammate for the rest of the career. But the key thing is though, the rest of the driver market activity in this playthrough is solely the doing of the AI. That said though, my old teammate Piastri went to Haas to give them a lineup made up of drivers who start the game in Formula 2. Tsunoda returned to F1 but at the expense of Joe, who is now no longer with Alfa Romeo or indeed anyone. Fernando Alonso retired at the end of the first season, which, rather interestingly, meant Gasly joined Ocon at Alpine, which is exactly how it will be in real life next year. And finally, that just left a space at AlphaTauri, which is filled by Schumacher. The durability of the engines took a hit due to a rule change, but the performance of the engines got better across the board, which is probably an extremely important fact in explaining how Season 2 played out the way it did. Mercedes benefited from a boost in performance to their engine as they had the joint best on the grid, and in the second half of the year it was always either my team or Mercedes who had the best car overall. As you could guess from how car development panned out, Lewis Hamilton was able to win the second season's Drivers' Championship, becoming an 8-time world champion. He sealed it in the USA with 3 races to go and ended the year 98 points clear of his closest rival, which was, predictably, Max Verstappen. Sergio Perez had a shocking year with only 90 points, barely over a quarter of what Verstappen got. Norris beat Russell and Gasly beat Perez in the Drivers' Championship. Albon outscored Vettel in their first full year together at Aston Martin. Mick Schumacher scraped a single point just like last year, and Valtteri Bottas, who scored 24 points in the first season, got just 1 this season. It's probably no surprise that the essentially one-driver teams did badly this year, as Alpine lost out to McLaren. My team, PSL Racing, just about beat Red Bull and weren't far behind Ferrari for second, but this time Mercedes were the only team to clear 600 points and win the Constructors' Championship. Just after Mercedes worked their way back up to the top of F1, a chassis and powertrain rule change looked set to change that, and in the immediate aftermath, it was Alfa Romeo who very briefly had the best car. That is apart from my team, as I saved every upgrade that was at risk. The engines also took a bit of a hammering, but I stuck with Ferrari, who still have the most powerful one. Whereas Mercedes' engine performance dropped by 15 and was the second worst one available. All of that meant Nico Hülkenberg was unchallenged and wrapped up the third season's Drivers' Championship spectacularly early, as he did so in the Italian Grand Prix. That's with 6 Grand Prix and a sprint race left to go. That's a given, I suppose, if you win every race up to that point, apart from the Canadian Grand Prix, where he finished just 1 place away from the top and behind only me. Daniel Ricciardo missed out on the Hülkenberg domination as he retired from F1, leaving Ocon to take his place at McLaren. Magnussen then took the vacant seat to Alpine. Zhou was brought back into F1 by AlphaTauri, and that forced Mick Schumacher to take the final available spot, which was with Williams. McLaren's uncompetitive car for the majority of the season explains Norris's drop in points from last year, but his new teammate Ocon was still no nearer than Ricciardo was. Magnussen was able to score a point for Alpine, admittedly just 1, but that's better than Ocon did last year. And also last year, Stroll got no points with AlphaTauri but got 4 this year, whereas Zhou, on his return to F1, scored 0. Along with both Haas and Williams drivers and Zhou, Vettel scored no points as well, meaning his teammate Albon beat him for the second year in a row as he got 2. Hülkenberg's dominant season gave my team the Constructors' Championship and a whopping 870 points total. Alfa Romeo's strong start to the year gave them 54 points and 6th in the Constructors' table, ahead of Alpine and Aston Martin. Lewis Hamilton retired from Formula 1 at the end of the season, and Mercedes gave that prized seat to the still 64 rated rookie Felipe Drugovich. But then again, he's alongside the still only 79 rated George Russell. You would think Hamilton leaving would be the big change for this season, but, well, just take a look at these race results and take a wild guess when everything suddenly changed. In between the British and Austrian Grand Prix, I installed version 1.07, and that had more of an impact than you would think, given the patch notes. It unfroze the driver ratings, which helped a lot of young drivers, most notably George Russell, who went up from 79 to 90 overall instantly. And the team mid-season swapped the now 72 rated but still extremely low overall Felipe Drugovich for the now 82 rated Oscar Piastri. Mercedes had the best engine, benefited the most from the unfreezing of the driver ratings, and most of the time had the best car in F1 apart from my team's, but it was Lando Norris who became the unexpected new tour de force in F1. He won every race from the Austrian Grand Prix onwards, and even claimed the fastest lap in all but 2 of them. After the update, Hulkenberg only made it onto the podium once. Any comparisons to earlier in the game save are sort of meaningless now, since the Austrian Grand Prix may as well represent a whole new era. An era where Russell and Leclerc easily have the pace to beat me and would have outscored Hulkenberg were it not for his solid start to the year. It's an era where Verstappen can only just beat Sainz and where Perez was outscored by Drugovich. And Drugovich only did half a year with Mercedes. In fact, Drugovich on 57 points and Piastri on 36 collectively scored 93 points for Mercedes and 0 for Haas. And both of them did half a season stint with each team. It's also an era where there's a chasmic divide between the top and bottom half teams, as Aston Martin, Alfa Romeo, AlphaTauri, Williams and Haas all failed to score a single point, but Alpine in 6th got 70. At least it was close at the top, with McLaren winning, PSL Racing 2nd and Ferrari 3rd, and all within 100 points of each other. For the 5th season there were a total of 8 driver changes. Joe rejoined Alfa Romeo to give the Italian team an all-Asian driver lineup. Max Verstappen left Red Bull, and I never thought I would see the day, especially given what I talked about in a video I made earlier this year. And I won't repeat what I said in that video, but since this career mode is being run on default settings, it sort of ruins part of what I said in it, not all of it, since there haven't been as many driver changes as there were in that save. But we've now finally seen Max Verstappen leave Red Bull. Well, sort of, since he essentially got demoted down to their junior team and now sits alongside Piastri. Given that AlphaTauri are one of the teams stuck in a no man's land in terms of car development, even with the recent aerodynamic rule change, this season is one hell of a culture shock for Verstappen. What I mean by that is that at the end of the previous season, AlphaTauri were one of 5 teams who were 1.5 seconds per lap slower than the top 6 teams. And at the start of this season, it's exactly the same story. Even Max Verstappen cannot overcome that kind of car performance deficit. So even just scoring a point would be miraculous. There are still other driver changes for this season, partly because Sergio Perez announced his retirement, but also Sebastian Vettel silently left F1 too, which meant 2 spaces needed to be filled. Ticktum stepped into Vettel's old seat at Aston Martin, that allowed Robert Schwarzman to join F1 with Haas, and Piastri's move to AlphaTauri allowed Lance Stroll to join Mercedes. Verstappen's demotion and Perez's retirement caused Red Bull to recruit an all-new driver lineup, and so they drafted in Valtteri Bottas and Yuri Vips. The thing is though, that's all set dressing because the engine ratings were the same, and the car development situation isn't even worth mentioning. So it was still the same basic story as season 4. Lando Norris may well have won the Austrian sprint race, but he retired from the Grand Prix. Even still though, he set the fastest race lap, won every other race in the year and set the fastest lap in all but 2 of them. On both of those occasions it was George Russell who took the honours instead. Lando Norris won the Drivers' Championship at the end of the European leg of the season, becoming a double world champion with McLaren in front of the Tifosi. George Russell was the runner-up again, and his new teammate Stroll was right there with him in 3rd, beating Leclerc and even Ocon in the 2nd McLaren. Vips got nearly double the points of Bottas in the Red Bull intra-team battle, and both Alpine drivers were the last to score points, even if Gasly got 70 and Magnussen not even a tenth of that. Verstappen in 13th was the lead driver with no points to his name, although he did finish 11th in multiple Grand Prix. In the Constructors' Championship, the same 6 teams ended the year with 0 points to their name, and we swapped places with the Silver Arrows, so they're the closest challengers to McLaren. Season 6 was a 3rd consecutive year with unchanged engine ratings and no rule changes to reset the field. However, by the end of the year, AlphaTauri and Alfa Romeo were up with everyone else, whilst Aston Martin and Williams were still stuck in the lurch. What's odd though is that Jüri Vips, who was Red Bull's top driver last season, moved to AlphaTauri. So Red Bull seem to have got their own teams mixed up as they're moving their best drivers over to their B team. He replaced Piastri, who is now, for the first time in this game save, not racing in F1. And instead Drugovich moved from Haas to Red Bull, and Daruvala became the latest Formula 2 driver to break into F1 by taking the vacant seat at Haas. In a simulated Italian Grand Prix, it was Felipe Drugovich who won. And even Ocon beat Norris to be the highest finishing McLaren driver. Gasly for Alpine was 4th, Stroll for Mercedes 5th, Verstappen for AlphaTauri 6th, but Bottas in the other Red Bull was out of the points completely. God knows why that Grand Prix played out the way it did, but it was one of only 5 races all year that Norris didn't win. And it meant that Drugovich joined an exclusive club made up of me, Leclerc, and of course Norris, of drivers who won a race in Season 6. At the very next race though, Norris sealed the Drivers' Championship and he won every remaining race to have 525 points to his name total, which is nearly 200 more than Leclerc in second. Ocon and Sainz bested both Mercedes, and yet again Stroll was right on Russell's level. Gasly, Verstappen and Drugovich all broke the triple points barrier, unlike their teammates or either PSL Racing driver. Tsunoda got a single point on the board for himself and Alfa Romeo with 10th place in Singapore. But it was AlphaTauri who really shot up the order as they went from 0 points in the previous season to 119 this year. Although it is worth noting that Verstappen contributed 100% of those. Season 6 ended with Bottas bowing out of F1, and Drugovich also left Red Bull, although presumably not of his own accord, as he ended up back at Haas. Piastri got back into F1 with a spot at Aston Martin, and Liam Lawson joined Vips at AlphaTauri, which left Daruvala without a drive in F1. It also meant Red Bull completely changed their driver lineup for the second time in 3 years, although it's actually a throwback to 2020 as Max Verstappen rejoined the top Red Bull team, as did Alex Albon. Even the return of a Verstappen-Red Bull partnership, completely equal performance engines and a lack of car development, which meant Red Bull permanently had the best car apart from ours, couldn't prevent the inevitable, as Lando Norris and McLaren sealed both championships for the 4th year in a row. In fairness though, he is the highest rated driver in F1 at 96 overall, one higher than Verstappen and Leclerc. He won the Drivers' Championship in the USA with 3 races to spare and ended the year with a nearly 150 point buffer over runner-up Verstappen. Verstappen was the top dog in his team, but not by a huge margin, as Albon was more or less on his level. Albon ended the year tied with Leclerc, and Ocon had yet another season which is tricky to analyse because he was thrashed by Norris, but 5th in the Drivers' Championship with what is meant to be, on paper, only the 8th best car sounds brilliant to me. It's just when you compare him to Norris, there's no positive way of spinning it. Drugovich had another great season as he scored 12 points, meaning Haas had their first non-pointless season since the opening one of this game save. For Season 8, probably in some desperate attempt to stop Norris and McLaren from winning 5 titles on the bounce, there was a 3 department-wide rule change affecting the chassis, powertrain and durability departments. I knew that wouldn't work though as soon as I saw that Mercedes emerged from it with what was by far the best engine at 90 performance. Renault were the next nearest at 82 performance, Ferrari at 80 and Red Bull were 13 performance away from the top with a total of 77. Carlos Sainz retired from the sport, which meant Ferrari, 8 seasons in, finally changed their driver lineup and they got in Mick Schumacher to race alongside Leclerc. Tsunoda was Schumacher's replacement at Williams. Drugovich changed teams yet again as he filled the space that Tsunoda left behind at Alfa Romeo. And finally Daruvala after a 1-year absence, is back at Haas. None of that changed anything though, as Norris won the Drivers' Championship again, and at the Circuit of the Americas for the 2nd year in a row. And McLaren had already sealed the Constructors' Championship by that point, as Ocon had his best year yet, with 361 points to his name and 2nd in the Drivers' Championship. Leclerc was the highest scoring non-McLaren driver, albeit only 12 points clear of Verstappen. The only two differences in the Constructors' Championship compared to last year is that my team outscored Alpine, and Haas didn't score any points, whereas they got 12 in Season 7. Apart from the engines, across the board becoming more powerful and the gaps between all 4 manufacturers reducing, Season 9 was just a continuation of Season 8. That said, it didn't feel like that to begin with, as Haas went from 0 points in Season 8 and 12 in the whole of Season 7, to 18 from just the Bahrain Grand Prix in Season 9. Daruvala finished 5th, having unbelievably started 3rd, and his teammate Schwartzman was just behind him in 6th. It's not like anything happened in terms of car development, so how Haas did that defies explanation. In the end though, the unstoppable force of Norris and McLaren won out again, and the Brits secured the Drivers' Championship in, you guessed it, the USA. At this point I'm really not sure what else I can say. We've seen multiple slight derivations of the same Drivers' Championship, and the only interesting changes this time are that Haas scored some points, but all of them were from that bizarre Bahrain Grand Prix. And Drugovich got a single point for Alfa Romeo, meaning only 2 teams, namely Aston Martin and Williams, finished the season with no points. With regards to the Constructors' Championship, the points tallies are different, but the order is the same as it was in the previous season. In the hope of preventing Norris from winning the final season's Drivers' Championship as well, I finally bought the personnel facility upgrades to give Hulkenberg a boost to his attributes, and at 97 overall, Hulkenberg suddenly became the best driver in F1. More skilled than Leclerc at 95 and Norris and Verstappen both at 94. McLaren had to find a replacement for Ocon as he retired. It was Théo Pourchaire who was drafted in, and at 88 overall, he's one of the best drivers now racing in F1 in the 10th and final season of this career mode. On the surface though, it's a bad time for him to join McLaren, since an aerodynamic rule change hurt McLaren more than most, and all of the engine manufacturers had maxed out on performance, so there was no longer any advantage in that regard over anyone. Verstappen kicked off the first race of the final season with a win for him and Red Bull, with Hulkenberg in 2nd, Russell 3rd, and defending champion Norris, he could only muster 4th. In Saudi Arabia it was a Red Bull 1-2 led by Verstappen with Hulkenberg 3rd, Russell 4th, Pourchaire as the lead McLaren in 5th, and Norris was all the way down in 10th. Just 6 races into his Formula 1 career, Théo Pourchaire became a race winner, as he beat the likes of Verstappen and Hulkenberg and had reliability on his side, unlike his teammate Norris. Nico Hulkenberg then won in Monaco as he bested both McLarens, and it was Liam Lawson in an AlphaTauri who took an unexpected 4th place finish, with his teammate Vips just behind Russell and in 6th. Meanwhile, the main Red Bull team left Monaco with no more points than when they arrived. Another race win for Pourchaire in Azerbaijan with only a 5th place finish for Verstappen meant it was the French rookie of Pourchaire who was leading the Formula 1 Drivers' Championship. Hulkenberg won his 2nd Grand Prix of the year in Canada, but notably it was Albon as the lead Red Bull in 5th, whereas Verstappen could only claim a single point. He returned to the front in Britain as he crossed the line in 2nd, but behind the formidable Norris, whereas Pourchaire finished in 5th. Those results put Norris ahead of Pourchaire in the Drivers' Championship, and then the Brit extended that lead with a sprint and main race victory in Austria. But the fact remains that halfway through the final season, Norris had only just taken the lead of the title race, and he was only 14 points ahead of his teammate Pourchaire, 34 ahead of Verstappen and 52 in front of Hulkenberg. Do you know what's weird? There hadn't been any mid-season driver transfers since Season 4, but this year there were a total of 5. Richard Verschoor was the final driver to break into F1 in this game save as he joined Alfa Romeo alongside Joe. Latifi finally left Williams and moved up the grid to Alpine, joining Magnussen. The big change, and when I say big, I mean colossal, is that Théo Pourchaire was dropped by McLaren and left without a drive in F1 despite how exceptional he's been. That's because Max Verstappen, in a bid to try and take only his second driver's title in this 10-season long game save, joined McLaren. The whole situation may be unfair on Pourchaire, but Norris and Verstappen together at the same team, you could not set up a more exciting second half of the season. Red Bull plugged the massive hole that Verstappen left with Pierre Gasly, and finally Felipe Drugovich is now racing for his 5th different team in this career mode. He started out at Mercedes, went to Haas, then Red Bull, went back to Haas, and then raced for Alfa Romeo for 3.5 years before ending up at Williams. Red Bull's Pierre Gasly won the Belgian Grand Prix, beating Verstappen in 2nd and Norris down in 6th. Gasly then got his 2nd win in 3 races, whilst Vips for AlphaTauri took a hugely impressive 4th place finish at Monza. More importantly though, Verstappen finished 2nd again, whereas Norris didn't even make it to the end of the Grand Prix, and that gave Verstappen the lead of the Drivers' Championship. He extended that advantage over his teammate in Singapore, but it was Hülkenberg who took the checkered flag. But most surprisingly, Drugovich has now been able to work his magic with Williams as well, as he finished in 7th place, which instantly put Williams up to 8th in the Constructors' Championship and meant it was only Aston Martin who didn't have any points to their name. Victory for Max Verstappen in the US Grand Prix should have all but cemented his place at the top of the table, as he had a 38-point lead over Norris with only 3 races left to run. That advantage got slashed at the very next round though, as Norris won the Mexican Grand Prix, whilst Verstappen wasn't even able to go the full distance due to a mechanical issue. But even still, the Dutchman was 12 points clear with 2 Grand Prix to go. Verstappen won the sprint race at Interlagos, but Norris won the Sao Paulo Grand Prix, which meant, with 1 round remaining, it was all to play for between Verstappen and Norris, but it was the former Red Bull driver who had a 6-point advantage heading into Abu Dhabi. I can hardly believe I'm saying this, but Verstappen was struck with a 2nd mechanical failure in 3 races, and that meant he was defenceless, as all Norris had to do was get a decent points finish. After the pit stops, Norris was running in 4th place and right up with Albon and Leclerc, but for some reason he couldn't hold on to the back of them and slowly fell away. He didn't have any visible damage, but his sizable lead over the next driver, which was me, crumbled away quickly enough to where I passed him for 4th. That still put Norris on course for 10 points, but his lap times were poor. He was almost a 2nd a lap slower than Stroll in a Mercedes, and I'm not even joking. Also catching him was Schumacher in a Ferrari and Russell in the 2nd Mercedes. Norris held on to 5th, but he was only a few seconds clear of them come the end, and given a few more laps, he would have been overtaken by all of them. That would have put him down to 8th, which only gives out 4 points. Quite genuinely, Max Verstappen was probably only about 5 laps, or heartbreakingly just 1 mechanical issue away from winning the 2031 Drivers' Championship with McLaren. But instead it's Lando Norris who ends a career mode he has well and truly made his own, as he won his 7th consecutive Formula 1 World Drivers' Championship. So that's the end of the 10th and final season in my F1 22 My Team career mode playthrough, and what an ending it was. What a final season it was too, unless you're Lawrence Stroll, since Aston Martin were the only team to come out to this truly epic Formula 1 season with nothing to show for it. And I always have to show this, otherwise I'll get comments on people asking me what happens after the 220th and final race. But honestly, nothing happens. You get the usual acclaim screens and all the rest of it, and then you're just booted back to the career tab of the main menu. Boring, but that's how it's been for the past few F1 games. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, my 10th all seasons of career mode video, and I plan to keep doing these in the future, and there's still some older F1 games I'd love to go over like this. Be sure to let me know your career mode experiences down in the comments, since those are always fun to read about, and I'll see you in my next video.